How does a hotel bombing in 1946 lead to the birth of a new country and a conflict that's still shaping our world today? Well, today we're diving into the dramatic 4 years that saw the end of British rule in Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel. For your GCSE exams, getting your head around the chain of causes and consequences here is absolutely crucial. So let's break it all down.
Okay, let's jump straight into the middle of the chaos. Take a look at this. This is the devastating aftermath of a bombing at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem back in July 1946. Now, this wasn't just any hotel. It was literally the nerve center, the headquarters, for the entire British administration in Palestine. And this single, devastating event is a massive clue to understanding why Britain's 30-year rule in Palestine came to such a sudden and violent end. It really begs the question, how on earth did the situation get so out of control that the British headquarters itself was blown up? To really get what's going on, we've got to rewind a little bit, right back to the end of World War II, and see what was happening with Britain at the time.
So first things first, you have to understand the bigger picture. Britain might have been on the winning side of the war, but it was economically shattered. I mean, completely broke. The new government had to make some really tough choices, and policing a volatile place like Palestine was a huge expense they just couldn't justify anymore. And what's so interesting here is how all these different pressures started to build up at once. It was kind of like a perfect storm. You had the financial problems, you had growing pressure from the United States, and you had a full-blown armed resistance from Jewish militant groups. All of this started to turn public opinion back in Britain firmly against the whole project. And that brings us right back to this. The bombing of the King David Hotel by the militant group Irgun was a massive, massive turning point. It killed 91 people, Jews, Arabs, and Britons. For people back in London reading their newspapers, the shocking headlines completely changed the mood. Support for staying in Palestine pretty much evaporated and turned into outrage. And if the bombing wasn't shocking enough, the violence then got even more personal. This image shows the human cost in stark, brutal detail. In 1947, Irgun kidnapped and hanged 2 British sergeants. And this was on the front pages of British newspapers. It horrified the public and convinced so many people that the price of the mandate, paid in British lives, was just way too high. So what's the bottom line here? Well, Britain was stuck. They couldn't find a solution, they couldn't bear the cost in money or lives, so they basically threw their hands up. Their only option left was to pass the entire Palestine problem over to the brand new United Nations. All right, so Britain is out. Now the UN steps in. Let's see how their attempt to solve the crisis didn't bring peace, but actually set the stage for an even bigger conflict. Now, the UN moved pretty fast. It set up a special committee called UNCOP to figure out what to do. But here's the thing. It was controversial right from the get-go. Most Arab leaders boycotted it because they believed the committee was biased and pro-Zionist, supportive of creating a Jewish homeland. So their side of the story was barely heard. And what was the committee's final recommendation? Simple. Split the territory in 2. And this is the map the UN came up with. Take a look at it. You can see these really complex, interlocking borders. They were designed that way to try and include existing Jewish and Arab communities. And Jerusalem, which is holy to 3 major religions, was meant to be a special international city, run by the UN itself. Now, these numbers are everything. They are the absolute key to understanding why people reacted the way they did. The Jewish population, who at the time owned only about 7% of the land, were given 55% of the territory. And critically, that territory included the most fertile coastal areas, which you'd need for any new country's economy. Also, look at this. The proposed Jewish state would have a huge Arab minority, almost half its population. So you can probably guess what happened next. The reactions were polar opposites. The Jewish Agency accepted the plan. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it gave them international legitimacy for a state. The Arab Higher Committee and the surrounding Arab countries, they rejected it completely. They argued the UN had no right to just give away their land and saw the whole thing as deeply unfair. And with that, everyone was on a direct collision course. So, you've got the British packing their bags, you've got no agreement on the table, and the whole situation just spirals from civil unrest into all-out war. And then we get this historic moment. On May 14, 1948, the very same day the last British soldiers sailed away, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. For Jewish people, it was this incredible moment, the realization of a dream. But for the Arab world, it was the final straw. And the reaction? It was instant. The very next day, 5 Arab armies invaded. This wasn't a civil war anymore. It was now an international conflict. For the brand new state of Israel, it was, quite simply, a fight for survival.
So you've got to ask, right? How did this new nation with a smaller population win against 5 invading armies? Well, it really boils down to one key idea: unity versus disunity. The Israeli forces were incredibly motivated, they were well organized under one command, and many had actual combat experience. The Arab armies, on the other hand, were disorganized, had competing goals, and crucially, they totally underestimated their opponent.
Okay, so by 1949, the fighting stops. But this didn't bring peace, not by a long shot. Instead, it created a totally new and deeply unstable reality on the ground. This is so important. Just look at these 2 maps. On the left, that's the future the UN imagined in 1947. Now look at the right. That's the reality created by the war in 1949. The war didn't just tweak the borders. It completely torped the old map and drew a new one. And the final result was pretty stark. For starters, Israel now controlled 75% of the land, way more than the UN plan had suggested. And that independent Arab state the UN had proposed, it just never happened. Instead, its territory was taken over by Jordan, which annexed the West Bank, and by Egypt, which took the Gaza Strip. For Palestinians, the consequence of this war was so profound, so devastating, it has its own name, al-Nakba, which is Arabic for the catastrophe. The term captures the huge sense of loss, the loss of their land, their homes, and their society. And behind that word is a number, a huge number, an estimated 700,000. That's how many Palestinians either fled their homes in fear or were expelled during the war. And a number is one thing, but this picture, this shows you the human reality behind it. The war created one of the most long-lasting refugee crises in modern history. And the fate of these refugees and their children and grandchildren is still one of the most difficult and central issues of the entire conflict today. Phew, okay, that was a lot. So, for your exam, what are the absolute key things you need to lock in your brain? Let's do a quick summary.
Right. If you get an explain why question, this is the chain of logic you need. The cause of Britain's withdrawal was financial weakness and insurgency. The consequence of that was the UN plan, which in turn was the cause of the war. And the key consequence or significance of that war was a new map and a massive refugee crisis. Cause, consequence, significance. Got it?
And ultimately, that is the question that has echoed down through the decades of conflict that followed, a conflict whose origins are planted right here in these 4 turbulent years.